Jason and Brian were two of my closest school friends. When it was time for Jason to graduate, he and his family had to relocate to Lexington, South Carolina due to his father's employment. After we graduated, and he and his family had moved into their new home, my friend Brian and I were invited to spend the weekend there. Out of boredom, we decided to go hiking in the adjacent woodland and countryside, where we discovered a beautiful river. It was a nice and serene location. However, we got lost. We chose to continue following the river after losing sight of whether we were moving upstream or downstream. We grew concerned about locating a telephone to call Jason's parents to pick us up, despite the fact that we could not find a paved road or street in the area. As we continued to follow the river, we came upon an ancient red brick edifice resembling a church with a dirt parking lot and gravel road leading up to it. It was heavily overgrown with vegetation and plants. We decided to go inside to check if there was anyone there and possibly use their phone to obtain the address for this business. We observed a few vintage automobiles that appeared to be from the 1970s or 1980s, probably Novas. In this dirt parking lot, 4 of them were filthy and rusty, with flat or missing tires. They were all white or had been white and parked side by side. As we approached the church, we could hear gospel music and some singing. We were relieved to see people, so we entered the church, which appeared to be quite old and run down. We peered through the main doors of the hall and counted roughly 24 people, dressed as elegantly as they could despite their obvious poverty. When we entered the church, the elderly woman with white hair and horn-rimmed glasses, who was playing the piano, stopped playing and stared at us without expression. I will never forget what happened next for the rest of my life. Everyone in the church stopped singing, put down their song sheets, and slowly turned their heads to gaze at us with the most unwelcoming and blank expressions. "We're sorry to interrupt, but we need to borrow your phone to call my parents to pick us up." The only sound in the church was the cracking of the wooden pews caused by the weight of the congregation. Therefore, we gently backed out of the door and closed it behind us, glanced at each other with dread, and went in silence. We began walking up that dirt road, and when Brian noted that there were no crosses or anything Christian in the building, we turned around and saw that a dozen or so of the men had walked out in front of the church and were intently watching us as we walked up the road. This frightened us, and we began sprinting up that dirt road for what felt like 30 minutes. Finally, we arrived to a really old, dilapidated gas station that resembled one of those old full-service stations. Upon entering, we observed that the shelves were mostly empty and covered in dust. Behind the bar, an old, overly tanned, swarthy man with an oily and filthy baseball cap was reading an old book with tattered edges and yellowed pages. He looked up and spoke up. "You fell short, huh? Simply return the way you came in. Turn left and continue that road until you see a telephone pole. At the pole, turn right onto the trail, which will lead you to a highway." As we proceeded down the road to the telephone pole, the man pointed out, we turned around and saw the old man standing in front of the gas station with his arms folded and a crooked grin on his face. We turned right at the pole and followed the trail to the nearest freeway. After approximately a half hour of walking in the dusk, it had just turned dark. We reached the highway and attempted to flag down some passing motorists, but nobody stopped. Thankfully, a police officer spotted us and stopped to assist us. We informed him we were lost and provided him Jason's address. In response, he whistled and confirmed that we were indeed lost. During the 30-minute ride back to Jason's, the police cautioned us to be careful in the woods due to the presence of psychotic witches. In the distant past, perhaps 8 years ago, my pals James and Sean and I did something extremely foolish. However, at the time, doing foolish things was how we passed the time. James and I are no longer close friends, but Sean and I still communicate frequently, and we frequently discuss this story. We were 19 at the time. In our old town in New Jersey, there were many vacant houses, and atop a hilly road near our homes was an abandoned church. Locals were aware of the church. It was located on a closed road and had been abandoned for decades. James Seen and I, being the mischievous thrill-seekers that we were, devised the brilliant concept of bringing an Ouija board to the church late one night. I'm not sure if it's still standing or what its current condition is, as I now reside in Florida. It was October, so I suppose we did it to celebrate the Halloween season. The Ouija board was in Sean's closet, so he brought it with him. I drove the three of us, so I picked up James first, then Sean, and we proceeded directly to the church. Because the road up the hill to the church was closed, we were forced to park on the side of the road and walk. We initially followed the road up the hill to the church with a single flashlight, so as not to attract unnecessary attention. However, after we reached the top of the hill, we all three turned on our flashlights. The church was bordered in all directions by woodland and had a gravel parking lot adjacent to it. The large front entrance was already ajar since the church had been broken into 1,000,000 times and was covered in graffiti. We needed the assistance of 2 people to open the door because it squeaked against the floor, but once inside, we utilized our flashlights to ensure that no one else was present. It was spooky to be there at night. And Son assembled an Ouija board. Then he removed these 3 candles from his backpack, chuckled, and stated that they would enhance the experience. As soon as the 3 candles were lit and positioned in a triangle pattern around the board, we turned off our flashlights. Now that the candles were the only source of illumination, the atmosphere became even more spooky and unsettling. We could not see more than perhaps 6 feet in any direction, so we began to play with the Ouija board. At this time, Sean did the majority of the talking. I cannot recall exactly what he said, but he began with, "Is anyone there?" as is customary with Ouija boards. As the planchette began to move, we began to giggle. I knew one of them was responsible. I believe that it is impossible to play an Ouija board with friends without someone shifting the planchette humorously. However, we agreed, and the person who moved it typed out a few words. During this, though, we heard a strange cracking sound emanating from the altar of the church. The only way I can describe the sound is as a large piece of wood splitting in half. It was loud and appeared to have been made by someone. We all reacted immediately by directing the flashlights on our smartphones toward the altar. As far as we could tell, nobody was present. After that, I believe both of them were as terrified as I was, but the building was old and falling apart, so a few strange noises here and there didn't seem all that strange. So we continued. We each took turns posing questions on the board, but the planchette ceased to move. I believe it was because the sound of the crack frightened us all, and we were now taking it more seriously. This continued for some minutes until a sound from the altar area once more disturbed the silence, before we could beam our lights over there again. However, something landed on the Ouija board, causing everyone to jump and shout. The rock was around the size of a golf ball. 2 seconds ago, all 3 of us had our hands on the planchette. None of us could have possibly done that. We all sprung to our feet and raced screaming from the church, leaving the Ouija board and candles behind. We sprinted down the hill and back to my car out of fear of being pursued, and we did not linger. I took us all back to James's residence, where we remained in the car for a half hour, conversing and pondering what had just transpired. Cousin is extremely religious and superstitious. He was certain that we had contacted a spirit of some sort. I do not believe any of that. I believe there was another person in the church with us, which is equally frightening. The next day, Sean and James returned to the chapel to retrieve Sean's Ouija board, and to make matters stranger, the Ouija board was missing, but the candles were still in place. When they noticed it was absent from the entrance, they decided to leave immediately. This remains the most terrifying experience of my life. This occurred in Warren County, Georgia, a fairly rural region of the state's interior. My girlfriend Marissa and I were driving around the region to see whether or not we would like to live there. It was incredibly peaceful and roomy, exactly what we desired. We are both Roman Catholic, but she attends church more frequently than I do. It was the middle of the day on a weekday, and there was no traffic. Before choosing on a location to move to, we inspected a few of the area's must-see attractions, Since Marissa has been an equestrian for most of her life, she needed to have a barn for her horses when we moved to a remote region. After inspecting some for sale houses, we happened onto a small, quaint-looking chapel on the side of a fairly quiet road with a large number of cars in the parking lot. This church was close to the last house we viewed, so Marissa tapped me on the shoulder and suggested we attend a service to determine whether it was decent. Consequently, I pulled into the building's parking lot and parked next to an old red minivan. I'd say the majority of the vehicles in the parking lot were on the older side. As we exited the car, I highlighted this to Marissa, and she agreed that it was likely due to the area's lower wealth. I opened the church's entrance for us, and we stepped inside. As anticipated, the interior was quite small. I would estimate that there were 5 rows of pews, each divided in half by the nave or center aisle. There had to be at least 20 individuals in there, although it was not a predominantly elderly bunch. Everyone appeared to be in their 30s or 40s, based on the backs of their heads. Typically, a significant percentage of seniors would be present in every mass, regardless of size. It appeared that everyone was seated in silence for prayer. As we sat down in the back, the individuals closest to us began looking at us, one at a time, and as others saw the staring, they would peek to see what the others were staring at before turning their attention to us. Marissa and I exchanged uneasy glances before turning to look at everyone else. We could only think to grin, but nobody smiled back. They were giving us the most hostile looks, and I just realized that none of these individuals were even nearly appropriately attired for a mass. What transpired here? This is when I realized there were no other women in the room other than Marissa. It appeared that they were staring at Marissa more than at me. Then, a man in a mask at the front of this apparent church, at what I assume was the altar, pointed at us and asked, "Who invited you?" I volunteered to speak on our behalf and explained that we were merely passing by when we noticed the gathering and decided to join it. The man was not a priest, nor was this a Roman Catholic church. The masked man stated, "You must leave immediately." At this point, everyone in the church was staring at us. I said, "Come on, honey," and we quickly stood up, exited the building, and went to the car. We did not waste any time in the car. I quickly exited the parking lot, but we both noted in the rearview mirror that a building employee was getting into their van in the parking lot. Until we noticed a gray vehicle racing up to us in the rearview mirror, I thought it was unlikely that they would pursue us. I programmed the Warren County Sheriff's Office into Marissa's GPS, and we drove directly there. The van was always behind us, not so close as to be in our faces, but close enough to be evident. As soon as we entered the public safety parking area, the van continued along the road. When it was gone, we drove directly home and never gave Warren County another thought. We certainly ended up at some sort of cult meeting, but I don't understand why they followed us, why they met in broad daylight, or why they didn't at least shut the door. When I was a Cub Scout, our meetings were always held in a Catholic primary school, either in the gymnasium or in one of the neighboring rooms. This event occurred when I was about 8 years old, and it was disturbing. But before I explain why I am telling you this, allow me to begin from the beginning. It began a few days earlier when I attended Mass with my mother and brother, like we did every week. We were typically late, so if there were no seats, we would sit in the back or stand by the entrance. Today, we sat at the very back corner of the room. My mother and brother then entered the pew first. I sat at the very end. During the Mass, I observed an older man with glasses and a white mustache standing to my left against the wall and staring at me. As I glanced over, he grinned, and I distinctly recall the ridiculous, scary face he made while attempting to be humorous. But I was 8 years old. I was not a child. It was strange and uncomfortable. I attempted to avert my eyes, but I could see that he kept glancing in my direction every few seconds. When I looked back at him, he made yet another bizarre grimace, which I presume was an attempt to be humorous. Again, it appeared peculiar. This time, my mother spotted it and touched me on the shoulder while whispering to ignore him. I suppose that she also gave him a filthy look. When I next looked in that direction, the man was no longer there. He had traveled elsewhere on foot. The next thing I recall about that mass is receiving communion. Then, as I returned to my seat, the man was back in that location, staring at me while smiling the entire time. I was returning to my seat. My mother observed it once again. And since we had received communion, we just left. My mother stated on the way out that she did not appreciate the way that individual was staring at me in particular. Now, let's fast forward to when scouts enter the picture. Occasionally, towards the conclusion of our meetings, we would engage in amusing contests or games. On this day, we participated in a treasure hunt. The artifacts we were tasked with locating were all related to the theme of scouting. I recall that the list included items such as a first aid box, rope, lantern, and similar items. We were divided into 2 teams, and each team received a copy of the list. The winning team would be the one that found the most items. Thus, we all dispersed. The recreational area included the gymnasium, cafeteria, and several nearby rooms. I was frantically searching through rooms and narrow corridors I had never seen before for items on the list. I was having little success. Eventually, I found myself in this extremely tight hallway near the kitchen in the back of the cafeteria. This corridor contained one of those ice cream refrigerators stocked with ice pops. I searched the refrigerator for the missing products, but found nothing. Then, I decided to smuggle one of the ice cream pops away. As I did so, I heard a man's voice coming from my right. I glanced around and saw the man from the church a few days prior smilingly approach me. He uttered words to the effect of, "Don't let them see you take that." He closed the refrigerator door and grabbed my hand, saying that he had Niker delicacies in the back, where children were not permitted. I removed my hand from his grasp and attempted to flee, but he gripped my wrist tightly. I looked at him and he said, "Quiet down." I cried help, and he released me while yelling, "Stop it." I hurried back to the gym and reported the incident to the cubmaster. Fortunately, my cubmaster was a kind and considerate man, maybe because he was a father too. He told my mother about it, and I informed her that it was the same churchgoer. My cubmaster would assist my mother in notifying the church about that individual. The man turned out to work for the church. I don't know exactly what he did, but the fact that he lived on the church grounds explains why he was there. What makes me ill, though, is that the parents of an altar boy have accused this pastor of sexually touching their son. The revolting aspect is that I can imagine what he intended to do if I followed him to wherever he was attempting to take me. I do not know if he went to prison or not, but I do know that the church severed connections with him following this.